The Shadow of the Erdtree DLC has turned me into a mad scientist. With all the new damage stacking items, I have been in the lab turning literally everything I can think of into a one-shot. You name it, I have probably tried it at this point. Like Sprite Stone. I made that one shot. Stay tuned for that later. Since the reception to my Palm Blast video was good, and I briefly touched on my build in that video, I decided today I'm gonna give you fine people all of the forbidden knowledge I've learned these last 2 weeks. Starting with the basics. The math in Elden Ring damage is multiplicative, so even if you're squeezing a little bit of damage using one item or armor piece, it's completely worth it because stacking buffs will take that little bit of damage so much further. Let's start with knowledge that might not be so widely known to players. DLC armor. A lot of people are aware Rakshasa is a pure damage buff and are wearing it, myself included, but it's also very much worth it to read some of the descriptions on some of these new armors. Weirdly enough, a lot of them are made with built-in damage buffs for specific damage types. Like Death Knight armor increases Dragon Cult incantations and skills. Reading that closely, incantations and skills. This is an important distinction because if you look at the Dragon Form Priestess Heart, this only buffs incantations. From reading this, I thought to myself, what's a Dragon Cult skill? The first one that came to my mind was the new DLC Flower Stone Gavel. Boom, you have a one-shot Ash of War. But is there anything in the base game that also has that same type of damage? Bolt of Grand Sax. Oh wait, that's not affected for some reason. But Lightning Slash for whatever reason is. Yeah! Booyah, baby! You want some too? But all of this to say, read some of these new armor descriptions, like Lita's armor. This gives a 10% buff to running attacks. Yes, running attacks, like one of the most common attacks in the game. And all of them get it. Oh my god. Not okay. Now, the next important part of damage stacking is, of course, talismans. I'm not going to cover this much. Y'all know how talismans work. All I would add here is read into some of these new talismans. They're pretty interesting, and some of them do more than what the item description would lead on. Like Retaliatory Cross Tree. This gives a 17% damage buff to attacks after rolling and backsteps, okay? Pretty straightforward. What this doesn't include is the buff also applies to crouch attacks, which is really important for roll catching. So yeah, read these and double check. Another example is Enraged Divine Beast, which increases damage of storms by 10%. You'd probably think, oh yeah, Storm Assault, Storm Stomp, all of those, yeah, got it. But you'd probably be surprised to know that this also applies to Stormhawk arrows when using a bow. Light roll bow shitters are eating good. You may want to start packing a pumpkin head for your invasions. Next, we have the most important factor to damage stacking, and that of course is player buffs. There are 4 types of buffs: body buffs, aura buffs, weapon buffs, and buffs that aren't attached to your player like Terra Magica and Holy Ground. This isn't new information, but what buff should you be running for what types of one-shots? Well, it ultimately depends on what you're trying to buff. Here are some examples. The easiest damage types are elemental because you can run an elemental crack tier that lets you utilize your entire Wondrous Physic Flask for damage. For example, if you're using O Flame, the body buff would be Flame Grant Me Strength, because that is a buff to fire damage, Golden Vow, which is your aura buff. The incantation can be charged, so we can use Godfrey Talisman, both Phlox Talismans because it is an incant, and Kindred of Rot, which you will always be using Kindreds of Rot Exaltation, and we'll touch on that later. If you don't know of any good armor to use, it's always a safe bet to run Rakshasa for the flat damage buff. Fire Crack tier and Blood Sucking Crack tier in your physic, and boom. If you're never quite sure if a talisman or buff is affecting your damage, it's always good to do what I do and just ask Steve. Steve is at the Secluded Cell, and he's a great guy. He's always there to tell you if your one-shot works or not. Simply divide the damage you're doing to Steve by half, and you'll get roughly what you would be doing in PvP. 3,800 divided by 2 is 1,900, and 1,900 is what 60 Vigor is if you're not using any talismans to buff your HP even further, and most players don't go over 60 Vigor. If you're hitting 4,000, 4,500, 5,000 on Steve, you know reliably you have a one-shot that will work in PvP. Now let's talk about the most important items that have been added to the game for buff stacking and what started me on this whole entire one-shot journey. Rakshasa armor, as we mentioned earlier, with each piece adding flat AR to all damage, and the more important of the two, Poisoned Hand. This is the item that made me go, oh no, but oh yes. Pre-DLC, you could stack Mushroom Crown and Kindred of Rot's Exaltation as a really nice damage buff, and tons of people looking to do big damage would do this combo. But adding in Poison Hand, you now get 3 buffs being poison, which is now easier than ever to apply to yourself with the new Deadly Poison Perfume bottle. You might be looking at the arcane requirements of both of these items and go, yikes, 28 arcane won't fit into my build. Doesn't matter. You will still get the buff of the offhand even if you can't wield it. And on top of that, you can still do the self-poison skill on the perfume bottle even if you can't wield that either. So no arcane needed to utilize this overpowered triple poison buff. This poison buff alone turns the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword into a one-shot. Have you met Meteoric Ore Blade? Oh no! On screen, I'll show commonly used body and aura buffs that I use. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to every single one-shot, but the goal is to reach that 4,000 plus damage threshold with as little effort as possible so it can be somewhat viable in invasions. Which I should add, if you're running Bloodsucker Physic, poisoning yourself with deadly poison, and Rakshasa, which is making you take more damage, it's pretty obvious that a one-shot build is very far from an optimal setup. But it's fun, and that's what video games should be about. Knowing everything you do now, let's talk about Sprite Stone, which as of the release of this video, might be the dumbest thing I've turned into a one-shot. We'll break down how I turned this adorable little guy into a nuclear warhead, because I think it was an interesting puzzle to solve. For starters, if you haven't seen this item or know how it works, it's one of the goofiest things I have seen added to a Souls game. It's a slow-moving projectile that will fly around for a while and eventually explode. If you use this while locked onto a player, it will fly right past them and do nothing until it either touches a surface or enough time has passed for it to explode, which is painfully long. I think it's like 30 seconds. However, they added another item to complement it, the Bond Stone, which lets you detonate that explosion at will, essentially making this a whimsical floating C4 explosive that they gave to the player. For whatever reason, I don't ask questions anymore. Swift Slash is in the game, and if that can make it past quality assurance, really anything is on the table at this point, but I digress. We look at the item and see that it has 3 scalings, A in Arcane, C in both Faith and Intelligence. So 80 Arcane is a must, and at level 200, I'll have points to spare to throw into Faith and Intelligence, which we did 20 for both. After extensive testing, despite looking like it does holy or magic damage with the explosion animation, we figured out that it's actually just pure physical, which 90% of the time means it's a Rakshasa setup. For talismans, there was not a single talisman that would buff the damage on this. So next to the Kindred of Rot talisman, we also added Bloodlord's Exaltation and Seppukuing ourselves, which I will only add to a one-shot build if it's absolutely necessary. For the other two, when all else fails, just stack more stats. So we added the Stargazer Heirloom for +5 intelligence and Marika's Source Seal for +5 intelligence, faith, and arcane. Which I need to reiterate, one-shot builds are not good. I'm running a Source Seal at rune level 200 to make this work. In our physic, we ran Bloodsucking, which, since I didn't explain this earlier, much like Rakshasa, it is a raw damage buff across the board, but you will be taking constant damage. If you played previous games, it's basically just power within, so it's kind of cool to see that return in Elden Ring. Then we added the Faith Knot tier for +10 more faith, because there's nothing else that we can add, and we need every stat point we can while still maintaining 60 vigor. Lastly, if you want to stack the most amount of damage possible, and I don't recommend using these buffs unless you absolutely have to, because one is really long and the other it makes you weaker, that is Commander Standard for your aura buff and Blood Boil Aromatic for your body buff. Do all of these and pray that one of your buffs doesn't go down by the time this 5-mile-an-hour Peter Pan fairy makes it to the enemy and you get this. Come on, come on, come on! Yes! Oh yeah! Fuck yeah! Oh my god, it works! Now go out there and be a complete menace in the lands between. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something today, and if you did, it would be awesome if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel. I have some really sick stuff cooking. You're in for a massive treat if you like the new hefty pots. As always, you'll see all of my content first over on my Twitch streams. You can follow me over there with the link in the bio.